Good evening. Hello. Welcome, everybody. I'm so pleased that you're all here in such a full room. It's a time of year I know you had multiple offers, but you will be well rewarded for your devotion tonight. My name is Catherine Allgore. I'm the president here at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I do see new faces in the audience, so I feel like I should introduce the Massachusetts Historical Society as well as myself. We are an independent research library. We're one of the premier libraries in the country. We are a nonprofit. We have 13 million manuscript pages. We're most noted for having the Adams family papers, John Adams, John Quincy Adams, and their family. We also have more papers from Thomas Jefferson than the entire state of Virginia, which I kind of like to throw that out there. But even though we have papers of presidents and senators, we have actually collections that feature the voices and the lives and the experiences of women and men and children of all races, classes, and situations in life. We celebrate the famous, we celebrate the ordinary, with a focus on family papers. And as of note tonight, we have material related to all three people, the characters in the film that you're going to see. They're in the two display cases in the reception room, and our Stephen T. Riley librarian, Peter Drummy, put them together. No podium. I'm working without a net here. And I'm sure he'd be glad to hang around afterwards and kind of show those things to you. We make all of our collections available to the public for free. We also produce an active roster of public programs, academic seminars, and we have workshops for educators. And we're able to do this because we have a wonderful membership base and wonderful supporters. So we could all thank our trustees and our supporters. And if you'd like to join that august group, please just consider applying to be a member. So tonight we have a two-part program. We're going to watch the short film No More America, which is a theatric blending of the words of three people who were 21 years old in Boston on the edge of the American Revolution. Two of them were Harvard students, Theodore Parsons and Eliphalet Pierson. I know I didn't say that right. And the third person was a newly published poet named Phillis Wheatley. And all of the script is adapted from the words written by these three people in 1773. The short film, No More America, was created for the Lightbox Gallery, which is an experimental space for the research and development of digital projects for the Harvard Art Museums. And this was produced in conjunction with the exhibition, The Philosophy Chamber, Art and Science in Harvard's Teaching Cabinet, 1766 to 1820. And we contributed a few items to that as well. Following the discussion, film will have a discussion between the directors, Peter Galison and Henry Louis Gates, Jr. I also should tell you that two of the actors in the film are in the audience. So look around to your right and your left and see if you can spot them. I won't out them. Peter Galison is the Joseph Pellegrino University professor in Harvard's Department of Physics. He's also the director of Harvard's collection of historical scientific instruments. His work involves the exploration of 20th century microphysics. On the side, when he's not doing that, he's tried to examine the links between the history of science and neighboring fields, and especially the intersection of science and art. Henry Louis Gates, Jr. is the Alphonse Fletcher University professor and director of the Hutchins Center for African Americans Research at Harvard University. You know, timing's all, Skip. Thank God, because this introduction was going to be super long. No. He is an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker, a literary scholar, a journalist, a cultural critic, an overseer, and possibly his most impressive and most important credit, a long-term friend of the Massachusetts Historical Society. So off we go.
To Harvard, the University of Cambridge, New England, 1767. While an intrinsic ardor prompts to write, the muses promise to assist my pen. 'Twas not long since I left my native shore, the land of errors and Egyptian gloom. Father of mercy, 'twas thy gracious hand brought me in safety from those dark abodes. Students, to you 'tis given to scan the heights above, to traverse the ethereal space and mark the systems of revolving worlds. Improve your privileges while they stay, ye pupils, and each hour redeem that bears a good or bad report of you to heaven. Let sin, that baneful evil to the soul, by you be shunned, nor once forget your guard.
My friends, the last proposition this assembly addressed a moment ago was this. The diversity of colors among different peoples arises chiefly from a difference of climates. Today, at the public commencement in Cambridge, New England, July 21st, 1773, the two of us, I, Theodore Parsons, and you, Eliphalet Pierson, will conduct a forensic dispute. This truly venerable, this learned and polite assembly will excuse us in attempting, in a few words, to examine whether the slavery to which Africans are, in this province, by the permission of law, subjected, be agreeable to the law of nature. Fully persuaded of natural equality, to the exclusion of a right in one individual of the human species to exercise any degree of authority over another without his consent, I am obliged to deny that slavery is compatible with the law of nature.
Pardon my juvenile imperfections. I am well aware of the difficulty of his task who attempts to defend a proposition of this nature. A heart replete with benevolence and compassion will hardly admit reasoning that involves principles seemingly incompatible with the happiness of any. Suffer me, therefore, to entreat you, Theodore, that every tender sentiment, that even the feelings of humanity may be suspended while we calmly attend to the voice of reason, which is nature's all-wise and benevolent author.
It is matter of painful astonishment that in this enlightened age and land, where the principles of natural and civil liberty, and consequently the natural rights of mankind, are so generally understood, that the case of these unhappy Africans should gain no more attention. That those who are so readily disposed to urge the principles of natural equality in defense of their own liberties should, with so little reluctance, continue to exert a power by the operation of which they are so flagrantly contradicted. Such multitudes of our fellow men, descendants, Eliphalet, from the same common parent with you and me. Between them and us, nature has made no distinction, save what arises from the stronger influence of the sun in the climate whence they originated. Yet they are made to groan under the insupportable burden of the most abject slavery, without one cheering beam to refresh their desponding souls, and upon whose dreary path not even the feeblest ray of hope is permitted to dawn, and whose only prospect of deliverance is in death.
That right of authority to subordinate others, independent of all voluntary contract on the part of the subordinate, is universally acknowledged. Such is the right of the governor of the universe, to govern and direct the conduct of all finite existences, and such is the right of parents, to govern and direct the conduct of their children. So too we must see a right of some individuals among mankind to exercise any degree of authority over others, and so too we must see that the exercise of such authority must be just. Slavery is agreeable to the law of nature.
When you have shown me the man or number of men capable of infallibly directing the conduct of others, then this exercise of authority shall have my approbation. And when you shall point out to me any classes of men between whom there is such a comparative difference in point of ability for the proper direction of conduct, as between parents and children, and the same disposition in the superior towards the inferior that the author of nature has implanted in the hearts of parents towards their children, I will readily acknowledge the exercise of a like degree of authority justifiable by the law of nature.
Figure to yourself, my friend Theodore. You are not unacquainted with African history. Figure to yourself the delightful situation of a natural inhabitant of Africa. View him, necessarily destitute of every mean of improvement in social virtue, of every advantage for the cultivation of those principles of humanity in which alone consists the dignity of rational nature, and from which only source springs all that pleasure, that happiness of life by which the human species is distinguished from the other parts of the animal creation. View him, moreover, in a state of the worst kind of slavery, most destructive of human happiness, an entire subjection to the tyrannizing power of lust and passion, the genuine offspring of depraved nature when unassisted by philosophy or religion.
In every human breast, God has implanted a principle which we call the love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance. By the leave of our modern Egyptians, I will assert that the same principle lives in us. God grant deliverance in his own way and time, and remove honor from all those whose avarice impels them to countenance the calamities of their fellow creatures. This I desire not for their hurt, but to convince them of the strange absurdity of their conduct, whose words and actions are so diametrically opposite. How well the cry for liberty and the reverse disposition for the exercise of oppressive power over others agree. I humbly think it does not require the penetration of a philosopher to determine.
You allege, Eliphalet, that at home Africans are in a perpetual state of war, and that by the slavers' purchase of captives many lives are preserved that would otherwise be devoted to destruction. Surprising, indeed, that the very evil this practice of slavery has occasioned should be alleged in excuse of it. One must have a favorable opinion indeed of that cause which needs the support of such arguments. These people are naturally peaceable, and less inclined to acts of hostility than the generality of mankind, the nature of their climate disposing rather to the softer pleasures than the fiercer
Consider
passions.
his situation as a candidate for an eternal existence. View him as necessarily ignorant of every principle of that religion, through the happy influence of which alone the degenerate race of Adam can rationally form the distant expectation of future felicity.
In their own country, Africans are unnecessarily ignorant of the principles of our holy religion, confessedly a melancholy truth. But before an argument can be hence derived in favor of their removal to this country, it must be shown that the advantages they here enjoy are greater. But if we examine the religious advantages of slaves in this country, I fear we shall find, to the dishonor of our faith, that they are not greatly superior to those of their brethren in Africa. At least the excess will fall far short of an equivalent for the excess of their misery.
It is evident, beyond all controversy, that the removal of the Africans from the state of wretchedness, brutality, and misery in which they are at home, so deeply involved, to this land of light, humanity, and Christian knowledge, is to them so great a blessing. However faulty any individual may have been in point of unnecessary cruelty, the general state of subordination here is agreeable to the law of nature. This can no longer remain a question.
The person that can imagine the practice of slavery, considered in all its consequences, connections, and tendencies, productive of the happiness of mankind, must, I think, allow that the direct way to increase their happiness is by every possible means to increase their misery. Eliphalet, I am much at a loss to conceive how your reasoning in favor of slavery in general could possibly justify us in thus forcibly subjugating the Africans.
No more, America, in mournful strain of wrongs and grievance unredressed complain. No longer shalt thou dread the iron chain which wanton tyranny with lawless hand had made, and with it meant to enslave the land. Should you, my lord, while you peruse my song, wonder from whence my love of freedom sprung, whence flow these wishes for the common good? By feeling hearts alone best understood. I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Afrique's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breast. Steeled was that soul, and by no misery moved, that from a father seized his babe beloved. Such my case. And can I then but pray others may never feel tyrannic sway?
All those who made it possible, and thank you all for coming. I'd like to especially call out two of our colleagues, Ashley Lalonde and Caleb Spielgostrom, who starred in the production. They're over there. Could you stand up for a second?
Stand up. Give it up for Peter Galison. This is his, really, it's his idea. Peter dragged me into this. I had no idea. Peter's a polymath. We both are university professors, but it's like dying and going to heaven at Harvard. And I've admired him from a distance for a long time. But we'd never collaborated. And out of the blue, he's talking to me about Phillis Wheatley and debates about race and slavery in the 18th century. And that's what I wrote my PhD dissertation on at the University of Cambridge. So I couldn't believe it.
Well, and you wrote a book on Phillis Wheatley.
Yeah, and I wrote a book on Phillis Wheatley. So my question is, I don't know the format, we're just making this up. How did a nice white guy like you end up writing about, make a film about race and slavery and Phillis Wheatley, who is obviously a genius.
Yeah.
Obviously a genius. Phillis comes to Boston in 1761, and within 4 years, she's written her first poem. At least that's the one dated 1765 is the oldest one that we have in her hand. That's just incredible.
And she's mastered Latin and started to and read a good deal of the Harvard curriculum, which people have brought to her in various forms. She knows the great poets, both ancient and modern. She's interested in astronomy. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, and it wasn't even her language, right? So she gets here, 1761. I don't know if you know the story, but the John and Susanna Wheatley. What was John Wheatley? He was a tailor, right?
Yeah.
And they need a house servant. And so Susanna goes down. They have a new ship of slaves that arrives.
Called the Phillis.
Yeah, and there's one little child, you know, probably about 7 or 8, judging from the loss of her teeth, that's often repeated, who's left and just wrapped in rags. And that's this little girl. And Susanna Wheatley buys her and names her Phillis after the name of the slave ship that brought her to Boston. And her desk is in this very building, right? I mean, yeah, we have her. I don't know what floor it's on. Can you go up and get it? Bring it down. No, and when I moved here, well, 27 years ago, and I came to give my first talk here. Peter Gomes, the great Peter Gomes, was a member of this society, and just seeing it brought tears to my eyes. You know, Phillis was put down by the black tradition for so long. 'Twas mercy brought me from my native land. You know, she doesn't exactly sound like Angela Davis, empowered to the people. But when the passages that you found, the one from her poem, and the other, the letter to Samson Occum,
Right.
who's a Native American minister up in New Hampshire. And, you know, basically says, you don't have to be a genius to know that slavery is wrong, right? Only an idiot would believe that slavery was a good thing. She was a very clever person, and she wrote in the language of poetry that was dominant at that time. So she couldn't express her opinions directly in a way that later generations, particularly of black writers and black critics, could understand. So they weren't equipped to or willing to decode her discourse to see what she actually was like, what she was actually thinking, because she wasn't saying, you know, white people should die, and, you know, expressing a more black nationalist thematic throughout her works. She was pushed aside after the time of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is very much in the news because of David Blight's magisterial biography of Frederick Douglass, which I bought the film rights for. And we have a deal with HBO, so we're going to be making a 2-hour documentary on Phillis Wheatley. But one time I wrote this little article when I counted the references to Phillis Wheatley in secondary literature about African Americans from 1773, when she publishes her book in London, until 1845. And then after 1845, people stop writing about her. What happens in 1845? They get a new Negro writer, who is Frederick Douglass. Before that time, she's held up as an example of black genius, of black intelligence, and that the Africans are of equal intellect with Europeans, as are Alexander Pushkin and Alexander Dumas. Pushkin's mother's father's father was a black African. And Dumas, I always forget. I memorized Pushkin's mother's father like a little nursery rhyme. That's the only way I can get that one. But, you know, they're both of African descent. And in the United States, during their lifetime, they would have been defined as Negroes, as African Americans. And in the abolitionist press, including William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator, Pushkin and Dumas were held up as examples of the great potential of Africans. So was Phillis until Frederick Douglass. And then she kind of disappears. And then with the politics of the 20th century, no one can understand what she's talking about. And so they view her as if she is a betrayer of her own race. And what I've tried to do, and lots of other scholars have, is rescue her from that horrible fate, because she was such a pioneer, and we should have Phillis Wheatley Day. You know, September 1st, 1773, when she became the first person of African descent to publish a book of poetry in English, because there was a black man, excuse me, who published 2 books of poetry in Latin in 1573 and 1585. His name was El Negro Juan Latino. Do we have any doubt about what color he was, right? In Granada, and he became professor of grammar at the University of Granada. And for my 60th birthday, 3 of my friends, the rarest thing you can own is a first edition. In Afro-Americanas, we call it the first edition signed by Phillis Wheatley. The rarest thing you can own in Africana is the first and only edition of Juan Latino, and 3 of my friends gave me Juan Latino for my 60th birthday. And I already had Phillis Wheatley, so that was cool. You know?
Well, you know, I think that one of the things that is remarkable is she chose an idiom to express herself in, not just poetry, but using classical allusions and classical constructions as a way of establishing a kind of cultural power for her poetry. I mean, it was something that couldn't be written off as just journalism. It made a claim to being about the culture and the world around us in some more timeless, urgent way.
Yeah.
I think, you know, you asked...
But it was a claim on intellectual equality.
It was,
Right.
and of being in the pantheon of poets, which meant something. And
Yeah.
so...
And you know the story too, which we couldn't tell in the film, but she had to be, in your article, I only have a manuscript, it was published in Critical Inquiry, right?
Yeah.
He wrote this wonderful essay about this disputation, the making of the film, the relationship between race and reason, as I call it.
I did.
He did. Now I forget my train of thought.
Well, I mean, one of the things I wanted to do was to answer your question about how I got involved with this.
Right.
And, you know, we had a show called The Philosophy Chamber, which Ethan Lasser was a key to. He's over here. Can you raise your hand there? And
Yes.
at the Harvard Art Museums, about this chamber, a room in Harvard Hall where people combined the study of the natural world, the theological world, reason in some very broad and capacious sense. And it lasted it really was a combination of, I mean, beyond interdisciplinary, it was the place where you concentrated thought about the world. And so as part of that, we lent various instruments that still survive from the 18th century. I run the Harvard Collection of Historical Scientific Instruments, and we have telescopes and microscopes and other instruments from that period. And Ethan and Chris Malinsky there asked if I might like to write an essay for that show, and I said, no, but there's something I've always wanted to do, which is to film a disputation. Now, we think of disputations like collegiate debates, like high school debates, but they were much more than that. I mean, even if you think back to Luther nailing his propositions to the door, those were propositions for disputation. Disputations was the sharpening stone of reason and truth. That's where you tested whether you had true steel in your arguments or not. And for hundreds of years, from the late Middle Ages, from the Renaissance, up into the 19th century, that's where you tested knowledge. And so I thought it'd be really interesting, and I'd have to go to something from Oxford or Cambridge, or maybe Göttingen or Berlin. But I thought we'd look and talk to Ethan about this and look at what there was surviving from Harvard. And there were hundreds of these disputations. And they underwent a fundamental transformation in this period. There'd always been this form called the syllogistic disputation, where you had to use the strict rules of classical logic. And no emotion, no moral arguments. You could argue about morality, but it had to be in this strict sense. It was in Latin, very restricted audience. The students came to hate it by the 1750s and 60s. People didn't want to go, they didn't want to do them. And then this new form arose called the forensic disputation. And they were before, before the forum. They were before a public. And they were methods of inquiry, like a forensic inquiry. And you would take up topics in those that were of current concern. So not just, what role does the monarch have under God, but does an unjust monarch need to be deposed? I mean, they were really the questions of the day. And by 1773, as this audience more than any will know, I mean, Boston and Cambridge were seething with an incipient revolution. When the governor of Massachusetts came to graduation, as he did every year, he was afraid. And he was in Milton because he was hiding out because the mansion had been sacked, and he came with a dozen soldiers. They got reinforcements. I think they had 30 soldiers eventually escorting him to Harvard Yard for the graduation. So so first I thought, well, why would the governor be so afraid? Well, he was afraid of the colonists.
Sure.
And that he would be attacked on the way. So this was when they brought up this question, and this was the only disputation that survived completely intact. The forensic disputation was written out, unlike just the purely oral syllogistic disputation. So the forensic disputation is the antecedent of the modern thesis. So when we scholars write undergraduate theses or master's theses or PhD theses, we're writing the inherited literary form of the forensic disputation, which was coming of age in this period, by the 1760s and 1770s, in the colonial colleges. So when they debated in Harvard Yard on July 21st, 1773, about whether the enslavement of Africans was just, they were debating something that was of immense immediate concern. And even if by the construction, you can sort of see that it's Caleb's part, this very smart, very interesting Theodore Parsons, who was at a very young age helped found the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He was really a budding, extraordinary scholar and scientist. He became a surgeon at a young age, and that's what he was doing on the ship, the privateer that was sunk in the Revolution. But these were two extraordinary people. Eliphalet Pierson was a mean son of a bitch. I mean, he was hated by every student that he took his classes. One said, it was the most the ruinous part of my entire education was being with him. They used to at one point they would call him Elephant because he would stomp around. And then his colleagues called him Megalonyx, which is a 2,000-pound giant ground sloth that was discovered later
in Virginia.
Named by
Thomas Jefferson.
Right. So it's Megalonyx versus Theodore Parsons, and they were the stars of their class. I mean, as you saw at the end of the film, Pierson goes on to become president of Harvard. He's trying to defend the university against these upstart Unitarians whom he detests. Right. And he loses. So the Hollis professor of divinity is a Unitarian. He's incensed. And then they appoint a Unitarian to replace him in 1806. He stomps back up to Andover.
Yeah.
Helped found the Theological Academy there. And, it's still considered to be a turning point in New England religious history when the Unitarians were on the ascent. So they're debating. And I took this. I was looking at the fragments, the archival fragments, the printed fragments, and putting together this disputation, and I couldn't stand it. I mean, I couldn't stand the idea of these two guys debating slavery at a university that had slaves maybe 20 feet away, 30 feet away, right in the center of Harvard Yard. And it just seemed to me morally impossible to do that. And then I began to think, well, how can that be represented? And what about, we know the names or fragments of names of some of the enslaved people at Harvard in that time, and we know some of the things they did, building Wadsworth House and other things, but there just wasn't enough material that was written by them that survived to make that. And then it was thinking about Phillis Wheatley and seeing that she was the exact same age. They're all 21 years old. She's living a couple of miles away, and she's one of her very first poems. I mean, she's a 15-year-old, I think, around there, and she writes a poem to Harvard, to the students at Harvard. That's how it opens, right? With this saying, in better than I'm going to say it, study the orbs of the world, study and profit from this position of privilege that you have to learn about the things around you, but don't forget sin. Don't forget the moral structure of the world. And so I thought that would be a terrific place to begin. And then these other 2 points where she intervenes, once is she's beginning to question about slavery, to put a sharper edge on her criticism, and then that final, the peroration of the piece where she says, the title phrase, "No more America in mournful strain." And I thought that gave it a kind of a structure, but in the course, but even as I started to work on this, I came to Skip, who'd written so beautifully and movingly about Phillis Wheatley. And, you know, it's not a historian's go-to move to take people that they never have met and put them in the same moment.
Sure.
And I wanted to know from Skip whether he thought this was a legitimate and respectful way of treating this material, because I mean, I think we both see these 1770s as a turning point where America made the wrong choice, and with catastrophic consequences.
We have to remember too that would the three have met? Most probably not. However, Phillis Wheatley was a superstar by this time. Now, on the day of this disputation, and I remembered where I was going when I lost my train of thought, Phillis is in London. And why is she in London? She's in London because no publisher in Boston would publish her book of poetry. Why? Because of the belief that Africans didn't have the requisite degree of intelligence to write a book of poems of that quality. And she had even, her master, John Wheatley, writes a little note as a preface to the book, saying that because no one thought an African was intelligent enough to write these poems, he had assembled the 14 most respectable characters of Boston. That's how they referred to themselves. I would love to think I'm one of the most respectable characters. That'd be a great secret society to be part of. And they gave her an examination to decide whether they could sign a letter of attestation saying this poor child had actually written these poems herself. Can you think about how outrageous it is? Not only did they, not only did she satisfy their curiosity or speak to their doubt, but they then published a letter of attestation at the beginning of the book. We, the undersigned, respectable characters of Boston, have examined Phillis, brought recently, as a paraphrase, a young barbarian from Africa. And to our satisfaction, we believe that she has written these poems by herself. And that convention of attestation of sponsors continued throughout the 19th century, including through the publication in 1845 of Frederick Douglass's first slave narrative, which is prefaced by William Lloyd Garrison and John Greenleaf Whittier, saying we know this guy, we've heard him, he wrote his own book, we've heard him giving his own, telling his story on the lecture circuit. And they had a horrible embarrassment in 1838, the American Abolition Society, the American Anti-Slavery Society, when a black man named James Williams, and Ashley knows I always teach about this guy, came running into the anti-slavery office in New York saying that he had escaped from slavery in Alabama. He dictates, he's very handsome and eloquent, and he dictates in 2 weeks his story to John Greenleaf Whittier himself. They rush it into print. It's the equivalent of a bestseller. And then the Liberator gets a letter from this guy in Alabama, where James Williams claimed to be from, saying there's a ton of rubbish and it never really happened. And they thought it was just a racist apologist for slavery, attack a good black man. They assemble a committee, they send him to Alabama, and 6 months later they have to withdraw the book because the guy had made up apparently quite a lot of it, if not all of it. So they were really burned, and they were determined not to let this happen again. So when Frederick Douglass stands more or less spontaneously in Nantucket at the Athenaeum and makes a speech in August of 1841, and William Lloyd Garrison is there, they hire him on the spot that same Sunday. And then they make him tell his story for 4 years before they let him write it, all over the North. Why? Because if he was lying, there were so many press accounts, those lies would be exposed. And so Phillis is the beginning of this tradition of attestation, when a black person has to prove that they are intelligent. They have to show that they're intelligent enough. Then they have to prove that they're intelligent enough. Imagine if all of your identity group, however you might define it, whether you're Jewish or whether you're Methodist or whether you're atheist or trans or whatever, imagine if everybody in your group was tied to the fate of your SAT scores, right? Or your ACT scores, or some exam that someone invented that you had to take. What pressure that poor child faced when she walked into, we don't know what the circumstances were, but when she walked in or exposed herself or allowed herself to be examined by those 14 most respectable characters of Boston. I think if they'd say, who was Zeus? Who was Apollo? Who was Cicero? Because as Peter said, her poetry is full of classical Greco-Roman allusions. But she did it, and she pulled it off. But the other thing to remember, too, is that any debate about slavery in 1773 is, by analogy, a debate about the relationship of the colonies to the king. And you remember that the descriptions of George III as a tyrant, analogies about slavery appear in the Declaration of Independence and a lot of the literature at that time.
And she uses this, as does the Theodore Parsons, the part that Caleb plays, in taking the terms in which the political liberation of the United States is being spoken of, and uses it specifically about the enslaved Africans. Mm-hmm. So it's like we speak of chains, and we speak of tyrants. And when Phillis Wheatley's last lines are about let no one else suffer from the tyranny that I've suffered from, she's very deliberately forcing the issue of the confluence of liberation of the country and liberation of the slaves.
If you're enslaved to the king, what about me?
Right.
Being enslaved to you.
And you speak about liberation and freedom and chains and tyrants and tyranny. How about applying it here?
Right.
And that's one of the things that was striking to me in the disputation was that that's so front and center, and at the same time, part of what Phillis Wheatley is saying. And then the argument, again, as a second element, turns on Christianity. And she also uses Christianity in the service of eliminating slavery. And the Pierson, Eliphalet, elephant, says, look, the argument is basically, yes, it's true, slavery is terrible, but being enslaved to the point that you will never face the prospect of religious redemption, Christian redemption, is worse than anything that might happen to you even under the abuses of slavery system. And Parsons responds, basically saying, that's a crazy argument. How can you think you're doing people a favor by subjecting them to the worst tortures that are possible?
We call it the University of Slavery. There was an argument, I've just finished, it'll be on PBS April 9th and April 16th, a new 4-hour series on Reconstruction, the period following the Civil War, of course, but the rollback to Reconstruction, redemption, and the rise of Jim Crow and white supremacy, and these arguments about the nature of black people, whether they were intelligent, whether they were equal, whether they were meant by God to be enslaved, they were horrible. And so there were lots of people before the Civil War and even after the Civil War said the best thing that happened to these African barbarians was slavery, because they were over there not knowing God, without religion, without civilization, blah, 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 and that it had been a good thing. And some people wanted to try to actually bring it back. So we jokingly say that our ancestors benefited from the University of Slavery, as if this is somehow a finishing school for African human beings. It's a ridiculous kind of argument.
It is.
Could we open this up?
Yeah,
to,
let's.
I don't know how we're doing for that. I apologize for being late, by the way. I was at a faculty meeting.
And it was so much fun he couldn't tear himself away.
I was curious whether after the disputation there was any discourse or outcome or expression of opinion by the people who had heard it.
Well, it was, because it was so popular in the sense that it commanded such interest, it was brought almost immediately into print. So amazingly, the book that Phillis Wheatley, the book of poetry, which had to be published as Skip mentioned in Britain, and this book of this disputation, both came out about the same time in the fall of 1773. And so we don't know whether they met, but since these two characters that were disputing were now famous because of their dispute on slavery, it would have been unimaginable that they wouldn't have read a book of poetry by the most famous enslaved person in the universe.
I mean, George Washington sent for it during the Revolution. But you have to remember, they wanted just to look at her. It's Benjamin Franklin comes from Paris to London to see her when she's visiting London, because an African writing poetry was something nobody had seen before in Anglo-America, or in England, or in the United States. And so she was a phenomenon. I mean, basically they wanted to look, I'm going to take 15 minutes out of the war in order to meet a black female poet. I mean, that's a pretty remarkable thing, and that's what Washington
And
did.
she would have been interested in the publication of their dispute. She'd been interested in Harvard. What 15-year-old in 1773 cares about Harvard University? And so she writes a poem about it. So she would have clearly been interested in that. So I think, I take it to be, I can't prove this, but it seemed to me completely plausible that she would have read what they had written about slavery, and they would have read the most famous writings by an enslaved person in the world.
Yeah, she was the most famous black person on earth between 1773 and the time when she died, 1784.
Yes, indeed, a wonderful film. Thank you very much. It is fascinating, the conversation. We are here among the greatest of scholars in the world. I have the honor of performing with James Madison. I teach high school and do other presentations in that realm, and so I'm very interested in the topics here. My understanding, at least according to Wikipedia, is that in 1776, Vermont became the first sovereign nation to abolish slavery. And whatever the details are, it's clear that slavery was ubiquitous in the world at that point. And so how radical was this debate? Would debates like this have happened 10 years before in other countries? I mean, my impression is that 1776 is a year that, the morality of slavery starts to really come to the fore. Jefferson writes his lines, and immediately everybody's saying, but what about the slaves? And so how much is this the deciding time? These years, is this when the world changes its view of slavery, or?
Oh, that's interesting. I would, you want me to?
Sure.
It was a crucial time in Massachusetts and in England, because it was the case of James Somerset in England, who was enslaved man who went to England and fought for his freedom and won. Lord Somerset,
Mansfield.
Mansfield, right, said that Somerset was a free man. And that set a legal precedent in England. That's 1772. And then slavery was abolished in Massachusetts in 1782, I think. You can fact check that. And that was very, And that was very early on. And you're right, Vermont was first. And there was the case of the black woman in, what's her name? Yeah, Mumbet. And Mumbet sues for her freedom and basically wins, right? And there were other cases as well. But the discourse over race and reason and its relationship to slavery is much older. For example, the Academy of Bordeaux in France issued a call for papers in 1744 on the causes of the blackness of the African, and got 16 responses in Latin and in French from all over Europe and what became the United States, right? When academic people sent in theses on why black people were African. Just a few years later, 4 years later, David Hume writes an essay called Of National Characters about the peoples of the world, but he doesn't mention the African. And I think someone criticized him about that because he published a second edition in 1753, in which in a footnote, he says that you can look all over the continent of Africa and you will find, quote unquote, no arts and no sciences. That Africans lacked reason, that they were a different kind of being. Peter recapitulates this in his article in Critical Inquiry, and I've written about it too. And 10 years later, Immanuel Kant, quoting Hume, in section 4 of a book he called The Observation on the Beautiful and Sublime, says the same thing, that not only are there no arts or sciences in Africa, but that there was a man who was quoted as saying something about the relationship between male and female, and he was black, Kant says, from head to toe, a clear sign, and I'm quoting directly, that what he had to say was stupid. Then Thomas Jefferson, just one more, just unless you think we have Scotland, we have the Scottish Enlightenment, we have the German Enlightenment. Now, what about Thomas Jefferson? Jefferson was even worse. Jefferson basically reviews Wheatley's poetry in Query 14 in Notes on the State of Virginia, and says the poems published under her name are beneath the dignity of criticism. Under her name. That is nasty. Actually, that means that she didn't really write them. Despite, and Benjamin Banneker, he trashes in the same letter. Benjamin Banneker was a mathematician. He did the first black person to publish an almanac. He writes to Jefferson and says, surely to God, you are the font of reason. You are the American Enlightenment. Cut us some slack, right? And he writes in Notes on the State of Virginia to that, no, not in Notes on the State of Virginia, to a correspondent in 1809, between 1808 and 1810, and says that Banneker got assistance in doing his almanacs from a man called Endicott, who was a white abolitionist and lived near him. So he cast aspersion on the level of achievement of both Wheatley and Banneker, and implied that neither had done their own work.
You know, one thing that we
And
did,
that was key to justifying slavery. It was saying that they are not like us. That either through polygenesis or whatever, they're not like us, and that God meant for them to be enslaved.
and that's why it was so important in the film. There's a moment when we end the sort of the second part, just as we come into the second intervention by Wheatley. Pierson says Africans lack philosophy, which meant essentially they lacked reason, which meant they lacked humanity. And so her response, I mean, the response that I put there in writing it was, she said, you don't have to be a philosopher to understand that slavery is wrong.
Right.
And so, I mean, it was really, philosophy needs to be calibrated to mean something like reason itself, not an arcane philosophical, not an arcane topic taught at universities, but really something that was definitional of who we are. You know, in the film, we used this, I wanted to use the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, precisely. I mean,
The music
that was here, and who's a great composer and had a big effect on the development of classical music.
And he's a mulatto.
Yes. So he was born of a white father and enslaved mother, and the father brought him to Paris, where he had a very eminent musical career, this really important work, and there's still not very good, not a comprehensive recording set of the music. It's amazing.
No, that was brilliant.
So we did that, and we actually we recorded our own version of it with some of the performing graduate students at Harvard, and Emily Dolan, musicologist and music historian, was music director for that. But we chose that precisely as a kind of musical counterpunch to this idea that there was no no 18th century contributions to culture.
No, and this idea of who's a human being, of course, goes back to Descartes. I think, therefore I am. We are reasonable beings. So if you want to know where this discourse comes from, trace it back to Descartes. And so if you are a human being, you are reasonable. That means meaning you possess reason. If you don't possess reason, you're not a human being like us. And how does one know that a being possesses reason? Through its expression, either its spokenness or its writtenness. And by the time of Hume, certainly, writing was privileged over speech, at least in the discourse about the African. They don't write. No arts, no sciences. These people don't write. They don't write. Then they're not human beings. But they, not to put too fine a point on it, but there was this huge library of books written in Arabic by black men at Timbuktu, right? About which Hume and Kant and Jefferson were totally ignorant.
Yes.
And that had existed by the 14th century, 15th century, 16th century. Timbuktu was invaded by Morocco in 1591, so the Kingdom of Mali basically, or the Songhai Empire basically disappears then. But, so there was a tradition of writing connected to religion, learning the Quran, of course. So you get to be a Muslim, you have to be literate.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you're a man, I guess at that time, I don't know, I doubt that women were being educated, but someone in this audience could tell me better because I'm not an expert on that, but I would, just assuming, considering the history of sexism in the whole world, I would be shocked if that were the case. But, so that's where it comes from. You trace it back to Descartes. And Bacon, in the New Organon, even before Descartes, in 1620, said that which makes man a god to man is the knowledge of the arts and sciences. That which makes man a god to, meaning other men, is the knowledge of the arts and sciences, and that's in 1620. So that the possession of reason had been valorized by 1620. Shakespeare dies at 1616, 1616, just to put it in perspective. And that discourse about reason and your scale, where you are on the great chain of being, which imagine that like a grand staircase that goes from amoeba to God. And there's a little subsection, there's God and then there's angels, and then there's a little subsection called the human community. And the human community would either have 4 or 5 stair steps. The European, the Asian, the Indian, like from the subcontinent, white, yellow, brown, then red, and then the 5th one always was the African. The only question was if the human community had four rungs on the ladder, or 5. Were the Africans human beings? Or were they really, and therefore at the bottom of the human community, or were they at the top of the animal kingdom? Were they more related to apes than they were to, it sounds hyperbolic to talk about this, but it's the truth. And people wrote about this over and over, which is why Phillis Wheatley's poetry was written about by everybody. Voltaire, Peter quotes this in his essay. Voltaire writes a letter to somebody and said, well, I guess we were wrong, these people can write poetry. And Jefferson justifies slavery by saying, no, Wheatley didn't really write her poems, and if she did, they weren't very good, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this argument goes through Hegel. And Hegel's lectures are published, I think, in 1837, and even Hegel's saying, in all of Africa, Africa has no history because these people have no writing. If you have no writing, you have no memory. Without memory, you're not really a human being. Isn't that amazing? We've gone from 1620 to 1837 with people ranking other branches of the human community by the absence or presence of reason. It's very astonishing,
That's
actually.
amazing. And it continues. You had a question?
Okay, so actually I sort of have 2 questions. Sorry. The first is just if Phyllis came here as a little girl, how did she learn to read and write English? And then the second question is, it's one thing to kind of intellectually know that Africans who were brought here were given the names of their owners. But then to just hear, well, Wheatley was her white owner's name, and Phillis was the name of the boat. And do we know what her name was before she came here?
We don't
No.
know.
We don't even know where she's from. I mean, we know that the ship came from, but it stopped. You see, there's a thing called the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. You could Google it right now, and we now know that it was put together by David Eltis and I see my colleague Donald Yakovone out there. I was looking for you. Good to see you, brother. He's a great historian. We now know there are 12.5 million Africans we can actually count shipped from Africa to the New World between about 1501 and 1866. 15% die in the Middle Passage, so 10.8 get off the boats. So this research project, which we funded initially at the Du Bois Institute at Harvard, has digitized the shipping records of all these slave ships, including the Phillis. So you can look it up. It's amazing, to live in this era when you can see the captain's notes about that ship. And it made a couple stops, or made at least one other stop. But we think it was from Senegambia. And 25% of all of the Africans brought directly from Africa to North America came from Senegambia. And another 25% came from Congo, Angola. So it's quite reasonable that's
In fact,
where
they
she
had
was from.
orders from the owner of this ship. Was it Finch? I forget the name of the owner. It was there were huge fortunes made on slaving.
Big time.
And you still see around street names and, streets that I've known all my adult life, like DeWolf Street in Cambridge, is a slaver's named after a slaver. So,
And fortunes made indirectly because of slavery.
yes.
Yeah.
And the universities were implicated in this. And that's another reason I wanted to make the film, was that I wanted to focus attention on our own history, our own place.
Everybody was implicated. Everybody was involved. You couldn't, you like tea, right? Sugar in your tea? Where'd that come from? Only we tend to forget because we were, as Americans, are raised thinking about slavery and cotton. But if you're from the Caribbean, sugar. And the richest colony in the history of the world was Saint-Domingue, which became the Republic of Haiti on January 1st, 1804. Sugar was where it was at, man. You could make a ton of money on sugar, and in Haiti and then in Cuba. Most of the slaves that were, when the first successful rebellion of slaves in the history of the world was the revolt of the black people on the island of Saint-Domingue, and they defeated Napoleon's army, and they became the independent Republic of Haiti. But you think that great profit from sugar just disappeared and people say, oh, forget it? It's only 50 miles. As Americans, we have terrible geography lessons, particularly about the Caribbean. You can't swim from Haiti to Cuba, but it's 50 miles, right, at the closest point. They just moved the sugar production to Cuba. And in the 19th century, slavery didn't end in Cuba till 1886, and in Brazil till 1888, right? So that Mary Shelley refused to put sugar in her tea because it was supporting the slave trade, right? So, and cotton products, right? Did you wear a cotton shirt? That was supporting the slave trade. So between 1830 and 1860, biggest economic revolution in the history of America, I don't know if it's still true, but it was true for a long time, was cotton. Why? You remember the Trail of Tears? All those movies you've seen about the Native Americans being moved out of the southern states? Why? Would they always leave out? They were living on the richest cotton growing soil in the world. So Andrew Jackson in 1830 signs the Indian Removal Act to kick the Indians off their own land so that white people could move onto that land and establish big cotton plantations. The profit from which was enabled by Eli Whitney and the cotton gin from the early 1790s, but then they could produce cotton in cheap ways. So where did they get the slaves? From the Upper South, from Virginia and Maryland and the Upper South. they moved 1 million slaves from the upper South to the lower South between 1830 and 1860 to pick cotton.
You know, there were detailed records of what the captain of this ship, of the Phillis, was supposed to do, and where he was supposed to pick up slaves and where he was supposed to deliver them. And one of the orders was not to pick up children. But he didn't obey, and that's how Phillis Wheatley got brought over.
Well, and to answer our other question, through the tutelage of Susanna Wheatley, primarily, we think, and the woman who owned her and who named her and who had bought her took an uncommon interest, let's say, in the education of this child.
And then their
she had
friends
good
came
tutors.
over, and all these Harvard graduates and people, senior people, would bring books to her. I think they were amazed, and then she'd read them. She mastered the poetry.
Yeah, like, come look at this. This little African could speak Latin. People go, no, get out of town. Go on, Phillis, tell them some Latin. You know what I mean? You could see how that would happen.
So she, you know, in a way, I started out thinking this is the 3 miles, but 1,000,000 miles from Harvard. But actually, it wasn't.
No.
She actually had a pretty good Harvard education while being a servant in this house.
Yes, and if you look at the biography of those 14 most respectable characters in Boston, what, half had graduated from Harvard, I think.
Yeah.
You know, they were Harvard men, and some of whom owned slaves themselves. So it was,
It's very contradictory and complex.
yeah, and complex and convoluted. The sad, the end of the story is that, you know, she died in squalor and poverty. She had 2 children, died at her breast.
And she wrote another book. There's
Yeah.
another book of poetry, which we desperately hope will one day be found. There are a few poems that were published as separate poems in the newspapers. We have those.
It
But
was
the rest
the
of it, no one's ever been able to find.
The table contents advertised in the newspapers in 1779, even with the dedication dedicated to Benjamin Franklin. And for years, there's a lot of revisionist scholarship now, but for years, her husband, who was a black man,
John Peters.
was represented as a ne'er-do-well. Maybe he was, but there have been a lot of, some black feminist scholars are recuperating him, saying, no, he's more complicated than we thought. But one story we have is that he took the manuscript and sold it. But we don't know if that was true. You know, I don't have this dream, and to tell you what a terrible person I am, that it's my Columbus complex, right? I wanted to find this volume. I mean, this is like the Holy Grail, the lost book of poetry of Phillis Wheatley. So I had this dream that a guy whom I had met at Yale, black guy who was a professor, Joe Scarrett, who was a professor at UMass Amherst. I dreamed that he had found this manuscript. And I was so upset, you know, and I happened to be going to a conference and I ran into it. And I said, you know, I looked at him hard and I go, did you find Phillis Wheatley's second book of poetry? And you know what he did? He looked at me and he goes, you're sick. You know? And I went, good, I don't want you to find.
So we're still looking.
Yeah, that's right. Anyway, thank you, ladies and
Thank
gentlemen.
you very much.
Thank you.